expand.
Welcome back. So welcome to the second part of the presentation. I'll try to be brief this time because the discussion will be more focused on Horkheimer and the three normative claims of critical theory. Like what I mentioned earlier, that a more refined paper on the same topic is published by the Mabini Review of Polytechnic University of the Philippines. So you might want to check that out. I think there's an online version, but I can also share a e-copy with you through Brother Roy. Basically, I'm going to talk about the normative claims of critical theory through Max Horkheimer. You now know that Horkheimer was the director of the Institute for Social Research, and he was responsible for designing the thrust of what would later on be called as the Frankfurt School. During their exile in America, the members of the Frankfurt School began to openly use the phrase critical theory to refer to their own approach to social reality. This was due to the fact that they were cautious of aligning themselves to Marxism, or they weren't even fond of calling themselves neo-Marxists. Okay, because when you are branded as a Marxist in America, that always spells trouble. Well, at least during that time. So they openly use the phrase critical theory to refer to their group. And as we have pointed out already, critical theory is not simply Marxism. It is a revisionist reading of Marxism and a selective appropriation of the ideas of Marx. So, because they were cautious, they referred to themselves as critical theories. Being in exile in the U.S., they were able to differentiate themselves from forms of Marxism like Soviet Marxism. The name was first used by Max Horkheimer, of course, in a 1937 essay called Traditional and Critical Theory. The essay was partly an attempt to describe a specific brand of social theory that is radically different from the kind of positivistic theorizing prevalent in the social and the natural sciences. It is also partly informed by the crisis of Marxism. This was, in a way, Horkheimer's response in 1937 to the crisis of Marxism, as the crisis of Marxism that we discussed earlier. The failure of, and specifically the failure of the labor movements and the rise of Stalinism, and also the the rise of capitalism, as opposed to the vision of Karl Marx. The crisis of Marxism was described by Marcuse in the following statement. He said, Marcuse said, without freedom and happiness in the social relations of human beings, even the greatest increase in production, even the abolition of private property in the means of production, remains infected with the old injustices. Considering its Hegelian background, critical theory seeks to present a social theory of the present condition of society and a meta-theory that is intrinsically concerned with the relation of theory and method. So, one of the things that Horkheimer talked about in his essay, Traditional and Critical Theory, is the relationship between method and the content of and the possibility of method, the content of method, the subject matter of the method also. Traditional and critical theory is an extension and elaboration of Horkheimer's inaugural lecture, which when he accepted the directorship of the Institute, he delivered a lecture. And this essay is partly part of that inaugural lecture. Where in that inaugural lecture, he sought to integrate various investigative fields in a holistic attempt to criticize society. The theoretical focus of the Institute under Horkheimer radically shifted from the somewhat scientific or empirical Marxism of Karl Marx, the first director of the Institute, to a more interdisciplinary program that incorporated the methods of economics, psychology, history, and philosophy. Horkheimer's Institute was to become more openly attuned to the German philosophical tradition beyond Marxism, that is to say, the tradition stemming from Kant, German Romanticism, Hegel, Weber, Lukács, and Freud. And we have actually discussed these philosophers earlier. And through a more eclectic approach, critical theory involves a set of ways of looking at theory and the world in a set of investigative research, textual, and political practices. Moreover, it provides a substantive, comprehensive theory of the present age, as well as a methodical orientation for doing social theory and research for relating theoretical work to radical politics. The eclecticism of critical theory was not simply a rehearsal of the philosophical tradition, but rather a sustained re-evaluation of the tradition. So rather than a theoretical groping, the re-evaluation of these philosophers and their recasting meant the reorientation of theory to its very own self-understanding. So that's also the meta-critical approach of critical theory. It is concerned about its method, the self-understanding of its own method. It is critical also of its own method and language. Next slide. But the core of Horkheimer's essay is his discussion about the difference between what he calls traditional theory on the one hand and critical theory on the other hand. What is the difference between traditional theory and critical theory? Horkheimer distinguishes a particular mode of critical discourse of society from what he refers to as traditional theory. Traditional theory is a very broad reference used for, let's say, Cartesianism or even positivism. A kind of theorizing that was predominant in the natural and the social sciences in the bourgeois society of Horkheimer's time that, of course, extend to our day. Horkheimer's program was in part the recovery of theory from what he refers to as closed philosophical systems, like scientific Marxism. Horkheimer attempts to draw a theoretical distinction between traditional theory and critical theory on the basis of their normative and practical goals. So, the way that I will describe or define critical theory in this presentation will be by way of presenting the normative claims of critical theory. And Horkheimer lays down at least 3 assumptions in his essay. First, the anthropological shift. Second, man's emancipation from slavery and the abolition of social injustice. And third, the critical perception or description of tensions that exist immanently within societal systems, resulting in a shift from what I call a class-based critique to a kind of social critique that goes beyond social class. So these are the 3 normative claims of critical theory. So in the paper that I mentioned, in my paper, my video review paper, the title of the paper is "What is Critical Theory?" Horkheimer and the Makings of the Frankfurt School. So you might want to check that out. But in the paper, I argued that if there's 3 common denominators among the 3 generations, the common denominators would be these 3 normative assumptions. So all critical theories, whether from the first or the second or the third, all critical theories take into consideration these 3 things. First is the anthropological conception or the anthropological shift. I'll explain that further. Second is and specifically the second one, right? The abolition of slavery, or the man's emancipation from slavery, and the abolition of social injustice. It's always a common theme among the critical theorists. And third, that the emancipative impulse is not only with the proletariat. This is what I was mentioning earlier. They went against Lukács, because Lukács was very strict in his history and class consciousness. Only through the proletariat can we emancipate. But the critical theories disagreed, and they broadened, as a matter of fact, that the Marxist notion of emancipation. Not only they argued that emancipation is not only possible through the proletariat. Emancipation could be found in other spaces, in other discourses. So one way of describing this also is the decentralization of the emancipative impulse. So let's talk about the specific normative claims then. The anthropological term, what does it mean? While traditional theory is an approach dominant in the natural and social sciences, based on the modern valorization of mathematical procedures, philosophically it was instigated by Descartes in his discourse on method. Critical theory, on the other hand, has for its object men as producers of their own historical way of life in its totality. So critical theory focuses on society as the society of men. Okay? The object of critical theory is men or rather, men as producers, okay, of their own historical. So the totality of men, rather, the totality of men as producers of their own historical way of life. That is the subject of critical theory. In contrast to traditional theory, which regards the social basis of scientific inquiry as external to itself, of course, we are too familiar with assumptions like in order for you to become objective, then as a researcher, you have to distantiate yourself from the object of inquiry. Okay. This attitude is, of course, very predominant in the sciences, okay? And of course, also not in the social sciences. As if the scientist doesn't have anything to say about the experiment, for example. But Horkheimer is arguing that even the scientist has something to say. The scientist always has an input. Okay, so a scientific experiment is by no means a purely objective, okay, process. It is a sociological. It is also a sociological process. It is also a political process. Man, the imprint of man is always in the experiment. So, in contrast to traditional theory, which regards the social basis of scientific inquiry as external to itself, critical theory focuses on real situations or social and historical factors that condition the possibility of scientific inquiry in the first place. Right? Scientific inquiry in the first place. Of course, we need science, but our motivation to experiment on something is always informed by the social, historical conditions that surround us. Okay? For instance, the bird flu scare a few weeks ago. Of course, we needed answers, and we needed the answers from scientists who will prove whether there was bird flu or not. But the motivation to do that is informed precisely by the scare, informed precisely by the historical condition, or rather the social condition going on. It's not a totally isolated, activity or practice. Horkheimer emphasizes the anthropological basis, which is the first assumption of critical theory, the anthropological basis of the mode of questioning of critical theory. He says, I quote, every datum depends not on nature alone, but also on the power of man has over it. End of quote. Much of science and technology today, by the way, is not simply because we want to discover things about nature, but we want to manipulate nature to our own advantage. This means that critical theory, by being aware that we also, in a way, dialectically engage with nature, this means that critical theory takes seriously anthropological factors that traditional theory takes for granted. For example, the perspectival basis of the questions that we ask, the nature of the questions themselves, and the nature of the resulting answers. In a more Nietzschean gloss, critical theory is emphatically concerned with the link between knowledge and human interests. And if you're interested in that, the early Habermas actually came up with a book called Knowledge and Human Interest. So the human interests, such as our material life, social, social, economic, ideological. Okay, our preoccupations, in other words, are related to knowledge. Okay, there are knowledge and human preoccupations or interests are not separate. We pursue, there's no such thing as knowledge for knowledge's sake. We pursue knowledge because of our interests. So Adorno and Horkheimer developed this Nietzschean line of argumentation in the dialectic of enlightenment, highlighting the human propensity to master and dominate the surrounding environment by means of rationality. And that's also the basic argument of the dialectic of enlightenment. Okay? Human reason has developed through history in such a way that the reason becomes not only a way of discovering nature, but also a way of dominating nature. In other words, critical theory proposed by Horkheimer is Nietzschean in spirit, because it aims to expose the non-rational factors behind human rationality. And one argument that they present in the dialectic of enlightenment is that what we now call civilization is largely due to our irrational fear of the unknown. Okay? Science and technology, medical science, for example, thrives precisely because we're afraid to die. We build structures because we want to be protected from the environment, and so on. So by revealing the non-rational factors behind human rationality, what they reveal also is the subterranean origins of philosophical and scientific discourse. Critical theory is a self-producing totality. That is to say, it called for an investigative method that would account for the various contradictory units that constitute the complexity of society without reducing the society into formal mathematical coordinates. As opposed to the ahistorical and universalist claims to knowledge of positivism, critical theory reorients itself to the social sphere, within which human activity and the contingencies of history take place. Inasmuch as the ontological terminus acquo of critical theory is the social sphere, its claims to knowledge will never be final. Right? So in other words, the anthropological shift could be understood in an epistemological sense, right? This mode of critique is based on the understanding that it has several layers. That mode of understanding is anthropological, and so therefore, because it is anthropological, it is perspectival. The answers that you come up with will be informed by the perspective where you're coming from. There's no such thing as pure objectivity, in other words. However, since we have to, it's also not right to say that since the critical theorists think that there's no objectivity, then they are epistemological anarchists. They are not epistemological anarchists. On the contrary, what they are trying to tell us is we should not be we should be too complacent about our presuppositions about nature, about society. we cannot be too objective. Okay? And so therefore, since there's no such thing as pure objectivity, we should always be on guard for other possible answers or perspectives. All right. The second normative claim is the political claim of critical theory, emancipation from slavery and the abolition of social injustice. Alongside this shift from mathematical to the anthropological, critical theory for Horkheimer does not deny the fact that, like Marxism, it enacts a political claim, which brings us to his second assumption. He says, critical theory is concerned about man's emancipation from slavery and the abolition of social injustice. In this context, the normative claim of critical theory is grounded in human potentiality and liberation. The potentiality of men to create and recreate themselves in society, which presupposes an appeal to an idea of human liberation, which does not necessarily entail total freedom. The emancipation of men from slavery and the abolition of social injustice constitute the practical aspect of this mode of theorizing. In other words, for the critical theories, philosophy is not for philosophy's sake. Philosophy is, you do philosophy precisely because, they go back to the 11th thesis of Marx in, the thesis of Feuerbach, right? When Marx said, the philosophers have only interpreted the world, but the point is to change it. So, inspired by the 11th thesis of Feuerbach, the critical theorists enact a political claim that now, and by the way, how can philosophy be the same after the Second World War, or the First World War, or after Auschwitz, okay? Or in our case, after Marawi, or EGK, or things that we see every day, okay? Nasty things that we see every day. How can philosophy still be the science of all things? And philosophy changes because of the political situation. That's the point of the critical theories. So they enact a political claim. Philosophy should help us understand society, because if we understand society, the illusions of society, we are in a better position to emancipate ourselves from slavery and injustice. In the context of capitalist society, such a practical goal is only possible when capitalism itself is radically restructured from within. That is to say, when the actors within a capitalist society are able to recognize and question the existence of human slavery and social injustice that result from the system's ratified articles of faith. But of course, they were very critical of capitalism, because capitalism too can be a vehicle for social slavery, okay? And injustice. Critique is done immanently in the sense that a comparison between the professed principles, norms, and ideals of a society on the one hand, and how they are actually manifested in current social practice on the other hand can be done. Put another way, the actualization of human potentialities is only possible under certain societal structures, or under certain societal structural conditions. For example, the radical democratization of capitalism and the abolition of social injustice is only possible when these conditions are met. Okay? Of course, it's a Marxist insight. Change the structures, we also change the conditions. We can only change the way we deal with it, we behave, the way we think, if the conditions are right. Okay? But if the material conditions are not right, then we can only think according to to the limitations of the conditions. It is important to note that Horkheimer's characterization of the anthropological basis of critical theory, while in a way still rooted in a Marxist critique of alienation, is a conscious movement away from the revolutionary potential of the proletariat. That is, from a notion of alienation and emancipation inspired by the labor movement, to which a somewhat scientific Marxism lends itself. Despite this decisive shift by Horkheimer, early critical theory is nonetheless profoundly indebted to Karl Marx. More specifically, to how Georg Lukács reads Karl Marx in History and Class Consciousness. Sans, of course, this overemphasis on the promise of the proletariat. But what they learned from Lukács is the anti-determinist and anti-positivist stance of this of Lukács, which ran against the orthodox Marxism of the 1920s. Now, let's move on then to the third and last normative claim of critical theory. The shift from class-based critique to a kind of social critique that goes beyond social class. I thought to myself, that's a long description. So I thought, maybe I'll just call it the decentralization of the emancipative impulse. Now, the third assumption of Horkheimer is the decentralization of the role of the proletariat in his version of critical theory. The shift is from what I call class-based, because it's the proletariat, right? A class-based critique of society, to a more encompassing and culturally oriented struggle for emancipation. Okay? The shift from a predominantly economic outlook on society to a broader socio-cultural sphere marks the Hegelian influence on critical theory, which is largely due to, again, Lukács' Hegelian reading of Marx. They were reacting to Lukács. Lukács was very emphatic. It's a proletariat. It's a proletariat. The critical Horkheimer said, no, it's not just the proletariat. Okay? There are other emancipative impulses in society. And so the development of the emancipative consciousness does not only happen in the factory. It could very well happen in the school or the university or seminary or anywhere where there's oppression. That emancipative impulse can develop. For example, Africans did not necessarily work in factories, right? But they were able to develop that very peculiar emancipative consciousness. That's what we mean by the decentralization of the proletariat. However, in contradistinction to Lukács, who understood historical materialism as having no meaning outside the struggle of the proletariat, Horkheimer asserts that there is no social class that could ultimately guide social theory, because it is possible for the consciousness of every social stratum today to be limited and corrupted by ideology. However much for its circumstances it may be bent on truth. Okay, So even the decline of the proletariat can turn ideological. It is important that Horkheimer points out that every social stratum is susceptible to ideology, inasmuch as every social stratum also has a propensity for self-reflection and emancipation. Now, Horkheimer's vision of critical theory is the orientation or reorientation of the masses to the historical foundation of all human activities, and to show that the idea of a reasonable organization of society that will meet the needs of the whole community are immanent in human work, but are not correctly grasped by individuals or by the common mind. Emancipation, therefore, begins with this realization. However, for Horkheimer, this evokes not simply the emancipation of the proletariat, but rather the possible emancipation of each individual regardless. And of course, today, it's not just labor that we fight for. It's not just, we also fight for gender identity and so on. Okay? The critical theory of society should always be oriented with the ongoing changes in the material conditions of society. Aligning oneself to a single class results in a myopic vision of society. Even the proletariat, Horkheimer writes, he says, the work superficially seems quite different than it really is. This is not, however, a simple displacement of the proletariat. Lukács's influence is still evident inasmuch as the image of the proletariat as locus of the emancipatory impulse provides a model for a critique of society grounded in such emancipatory possibility or impulse. This is still Horkheimer's point of departure. However, early critical theory ramifies from the Lukácsian model in at least two interrelated ways. First is the expansion of the emancipatory impulse by locating it in groups aside from the proletariat. And second is the emphatic theorization of the experiences of those who are affected by the pathologies bred within the capitalist form of life, but who are not able to theorize themselves precisely because the conditions do not allow them. That's why in one statement given by Adorno, which in a way is a reflection of a statement from Benjamin, okay, that the role of philosophy is to give voice to the voiceless. Benjamin said, hope is only possible because of the hopeless. With this preoccupation with the age-old problem of social representation, critical theory assumes the position of a comprehensive social critique. Horkheimer further argues that too much reliance on the revolutionary force of the proletariat results in a false optimism, a happy feeling being linked with an immense force that, when shattered in defeat, turns into an ungrounded pessimism about the redemptive forces in society. The task of a critical theorist is not simply to align himself or herself to a single class in society, or simply indulge in describing the psychological behavior of a particular group, but rather to show that each class, each category or system in society carries within itself the very structural opposition or contradiction that brings about its eventual collapse. But ultimately, for Horkheimer, the prediction of this collapse, along with the dialectical conflicts that come with it, can be understood by the critical theorist as a process of interaction in which awareness comes to flower along with its liberating but also its aggressive forces, which incite while also requiring discipline. And this is already my last paragraph. The perception of the structural tension, I'm not sure if I have, do I have another slide? Wala na? The perception of the structural tension immanent within a social system or discourse could be viewed as a redemptive force, whereby the awareness of an agent is a critical nudge that opposes itself to the defenders of the status quo and the conformists. More importantly, critical theory in this context becomes its own self-reflective critique. On the one hand, Horkheimer's proposed program, as a critique of a complex rationalized society, sought to be interdisciplinary by bringing together the discourses of the social sciences and the humanities, with the hope that such rapprochement is able to provide a more comprehensive analysis of society without being blind to the reality of ideology, power, and social injustice. On the other hand, it was a program that was critical of the supposed objectivity or neutrality claimed by traditional theories that ignore actual historical facts. So by looking into these three normative claims, we are able to understand the common themes that the three generations of the Frankfurt School address. So all of them are concerned about, the anthropological basis of society, and like I said, we understand this in the context of epistemology, right? The way we understand land, the way we create knowledge, the way we receive knowledge, and the relationship between knowledge formation and human interests. Secondly, the political claim or the political normative claim is based on the assumption that any theorizing, whether that is philosophy or whatever, it should be based on the awareness of human suffering. And therefore, the philosophy will change forever, precisely because now you don't just do philosophy for the sake of wisdom, but philosophy is precisely a possible way of alleviating human suffering. And then thirdly, that the possibility of freedom, the possibility of emancipation, that is not only found in the proletariat. On the contrary, the emancipative impulse and the development of that emancipative consciousness can happen in various spaces and situations. So I promise that I'll be brief, so I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor, for your comprehensive talk. Now we will immediately proceed to the open forum. So if anyone has a question, you may use the microphone here. Anyone has?
Thank you for the lecture critical theory. When I was following your lecture, what comes to my mind is that to be critical, such a theory must also have a practical purpose, as you explained already, the emancipatory interest, emancipatory intent. And in the critical theory maintains that man can change reality, as philosophy. In the context of critical theory, should change the world. But of course, change simply for the sake of change is not acceptable. Critical theory must also articulate evaluative standards in itself for identifying progress and regress, change. But my question is, what is the evaluative standards of critical theory? Is it critique itself, as Kant told in the Critique of Judgment, the power of reflexive judgments which begin with a particular instance, something like that will bring us going back to what he says in the critique of practical reason, to goodwill. My question is, what is the technology standards of critical theory to help us to build a better world?
Okay, thank you for your feelings. That's a very good question, but it depends on who you're going to focus on. If you're going to focus on Horkheimer, then he will provide you with the three normative claims. But like I said, these three normative claims are found in all critical theories. Adorno, I don't think you'll get a straightforward answer from Adorno if you're looking for straightforward evaluative standards. Habermas would provide you a more or less straightforward normative basis, because he uses the normativity of language, and then he also mentions in some of his works that, of course, we are all familiar with this idea of the ideal speech situation, which becomes the normative standard. If we are going to resolve a conflict, then we sit down and talk, but we have to be able to use a language that both of us or all of us here can understand, so that we create that ideal speech situation. But but language doesn't only come in, let's say, English or Filipino or German. As a matter of fact, Habermas also understands language as, for example, juridical language, right? So if we have a set if we have a taxonomy, for example, or set of words that will allow us to converse in such a way that we arrive at a specific agreement, right? Then it's possible for us to agree, at least on a specific point. So Habermas provides, so if you're going to read Habermas, most probably that's the answer that you will get. Now when you get to Honneth, he's a very interesting critical theorist because, like I said earlier, he builds on the communicative theory of Habermas, but he also goes beyond the communicative theory. For Honneth, we cannot resolve our social problems, what he refers to as social pathologies. They are deeper than simply misunderstanding. Because social pathologies are matters of recognition, that is communication. So in his theory of recognition, he provides us with three spheres of recognition, where he talks about three spheres of recognition: care, respect, and self-esteem. It takes one semester to discuss all of this, but I'll try to put it in a nutshell. It's actually a philosophical anthropology, because Honneth explains recognition in such a way that he is able to explain how we develop as human beings, how we develop as persons, how we develop as social persons. Okay, and that inspired by Hegel's philosophy of right, he understands democracy, a democratic society, based on his philosophical anthropology. In other words, for Honneth, democratic society wouldn't work unless all the three spheres are accounted for. Well, let me put it this way. For example, in the sphere of care or love, an individual needs to be nurtured by basically the family. It is through the mother and the father that the child is able to learn how to talk and to relate to another person. Without these basic skills, it would be impossible for the child to integrate himself or herself in a bigger community, to socialize with other kids, for example. And when the child starts socializing with other kids, that's already the sphere of respect. Because, when you make friends, you see yourselves as equal, right? And it is also through this sphere that you develop, that's why it's called the sphere of respect, because it is here where you are able to apply rules and regulations and so on. Horan also refers to this as the sphere of he refers to it as the juridical sphere, because it's also the sphere where we, for example, practice our right to suffrage, and but being accepted by that group, by that community, being able to participate in the activities of that community will allow us also, according to Horan, to develop a sense of self-esteem. So, in other words, recognition on the one hand comes in stages. If you weren't brought up in a good environment, right? If you were, for example, as a kid, you were abused, okay? You were not fed, or you didn't have proper education, it would be logically, it would be very difficult for you to be integrated in a bigger community. And if you are not accepted by if you don't develop a sense of acceptance, a sense of respect in that community, it will also be very difficult for you to develop a sense of self-esteem. In other words, the possibility of you contributing something unique to that society or to that social group. So, in a way, these spheres of recognition are spheres of acceptance. First, you get accepted you become a member of a family, and that's how you develop your basic social skills. Okay, and then when you have developed your basic social skills, then you are ready to go out and become part of a bigger community. And that bigger community, because you are accepted by the bigger community, you are allowed to be part of that community and participate in voting, participate in decision making, participate in participate in the rules and regulations of that group. That becomes a condition for self-esteem, because you develop your unique sense of self. So, going back to your question further, the answer is that it depends on the critical theories you are reading. If we are looking for straightforward evaluative standards, we will just disappoint ourselves, because they will answer the question differently depending on the philosopher. We have varying degrees of, perhaps on our part, we will have varying degrees of understanding. For example, if Adorno said, we live in the wrong state of things, and the only way out of this situation is through the work of art. Right? Now, what does it mean by that? The thing is that we wouldn't be able to understand what he means unless we actually indulge in reading Adorno. So, some critical theories are more straightforward, however. Like, like Honnet. Honnet is more straightforward in such a way that he does provide us with, in a way, straightforward, a more or less straightforward way of understanding how the development of human subjectivity is actually in line with one's integration in society, and that you don't become who you are if you're isolated from social groups. Okay? But I don't know if that you would call that evaluative standards. But at least in the case of Honnet, we have a way of understanding how, for example, the reason why we feel oppressed, or the reason why we feel abused or bullied, right? For Honnet, it's a form of misrecognition, a form of disrespect, and but not exactly evaluative standards. Not exactly evaluative standards. But we could build on them. We could develop some kind of anyway. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Professor Bolaños. I just want some clarification. In the context of the revolutionary ideology, they want to abolish this capitalist system or the capitalist ideology, in which these are the sources of oppression or alienation, and they control our minds, educate the social institution particularly. Does the critical theory also wants to abolish this kind of capitalist ideology or capitalist system to become more emancipative, or because of this emancipative impulses, or this critical theory wants to reflect us that this is our social condition? So my question is, does this critical theory wants to abolish also this oppressive ideology?
Thank you. I'm not really sure if critical theory wants to abolish capitalism. It's Marxism, traditional Marxism, that wants to abolish capitalism. What critical theory does is to expose the pathological instances that occur within a capitalist system. And so, especially the early critical theories, their intention is not to provide clear-cut solutions, but their intention was simply to disclose, that's basically what they want to do, critique, that is to disclose social pathologies. Adorno even says that we cannot totally, eradicate capitalism. We cannot, or what he refers to as the culture industry. But what can we do in order not to be engulfed by the culture industry, right? At the same time, they're also open to the possibility of any system, not only capitalism, to sort of open the system, opening itself to critique, to self-criticism. But there's always this, whether we like it or not, there's always this tendency that any system could become ideological. Another broader figure, right, for the critical theory is Ernst Bloch, for example, who wrote the principle of hope, right, in the spirit of utopia. Ernst Bloch understands utopia as, or rather, he talks about utopian visions, right? And utopian visions can be found in our religious practices, or even going to even a TV ad could provide us with utopian visions, right? Or utopian impulses or whatever. So one is that they don't think that that capitalism can really be eradicated. But we have to expose, the ideological and pathological tendencies of the system. For example, in Holland, you don't find the same strong criticism leveled against capitalism anymore. Because for Holland, some spaces in capitalism are actually spaces of democratic practices. And so, therefore, there's at least to some extent little promise in capitalism. But of course, maybe it's not capitalism anymore, right? Maybe it has evolved. Another thing, for example, is that Honek talks about is the workplace. The recognition that you receive in the workplace. It's very different from traditional Marxism, where in the workplace is basically, if you read, the insights of Marx regarding the workplace, let's say. Of course, he was talking about the mines and the factories. The workplace is a terrible place for Karl Marx, and precisely because it's a terrible place, it is a vacant place for the development of the emancipatory consciousness, right? In Holland, it's different. The workplace is actually a positive place because it is one of the places where you develop self-esteem. Okay. But maybe we should not be too quick in saying, and then therefore there's nothing wrong with capitalism. There's nothing wrong with being, for example, a slave to this system. Okay, it's okay that I end up being doing something that I did not train for, and it's work anyway. Okay, we shouldn't be too quick in saying that, because whether we like it or not, there are also forms of alienation or estrangement that that develop in these spaces. So, in other words, critical theory is not simply a straightforward, it does not wage a war against capitalism, but it does expose the limitations, the pathological tendencies of capitalism. But at the same time, it is also open to the possible democratic spaces that capitalism creates. But again, it's not a black and white thing. It's a continuous critique. It's a continuous critique. In Holland, for example, even capitalism contributes to the development of a democratic state. But he's not saying, therefore, the state should be capitalistic. He doesn't say that. But only elements of capitalism. Right? Not capitalism in the monstrosity of capitalism, that everything is for profit. Anyway. Yes, maybe one more question.
We got two more. I have two then.
you, Doctor, for the input. Actually, for my personal learning, this is my first time to encounter this, although we had some inputs already in the class. My question, based on your intro and what you shared with us, I want to really ask if really Hegel, shouldn't we accept his phenomenology than taking critique as the word to say? Because when you talk about critique to anybody, the first thing is doubting or being skeptical of someone's article or whatever. So when I heard the word, what is critical theory? From your sharing and the input we had this morning, that is some things I was really expecting, because when we talk about Manuel Kant, of what I've learned, of what I've read already, if you talk about the criterion of Kant, we have about three, where we have the soul, breaking up back the split epistemology, we have the soul, we have the freedom, and then God follows. So how can a critic comes in when we talk about the criterion of Kant, knowing that Kant is like a father of capitalism, and then his first works, which everybody knows about, is the critics of pure reason. So is there anything pure when we talk about the soul, the freedom, and God, when we bring in the criterion?
Okay, that's a handful. At first, it's the first time for me to hear that Kant is the father of capitalism. But that's a very interesting question, though. God, freedom, immortality, these are ideas in the critique of pure reason. They are ideas precisely because we cannot know God, freedom, and immortality. They are just there. Kant defines knowledge as the combination of sensibility and understanding. We only have understanding of God, freedom, and immortality, but we don't have sensibility of these ideas. Critique in Kant is not the critique of God, freedom, and immortality. Critique means assessment of the powers of understanding in the critique of pure reason. What are the possibilities and limitations of pure reason? Just reason. Just human reason. If I sound like Brother Robbie, then you have to blame him because I learned Kant from him. The critique of judgment, the critique of or the critique of practical reason, it's the same thing. No, I think when Kant used the word critique, it is synonymous to an account of, an analysis of the possibilities and limitations of whatever it is that you're talking about. In the case of the critique of pure reason, it's reason, it's human reason. And then in the course of his analysis, he figured out that there are things that we can know, things that we can define as knowledge based on a specific criterion or definition of knowledge, but there are also things like ideas that don't fit in the definition of knowledge. He's not exactly criticizing God, freedom, and immortality. These are just, a priori ideas, so to speak. Now, what the second thing that you mentioned, the relationship between, so that's the sense of critique in Kant. The sense of critique in Hegel, like I said, Hegel did not use exactly the word critique, but a critical theorist understood his phenomenology as a kind of critique of the illusions of consciousness. That's why this dialectical movement from Stoicism, for example, the critique in the phenomenology of the spirit, from Stoicism to skepticism to unhappy consciousness, these are movements in the self-understanding of consciousness. So in other words, the journey, again, the word phenomenology in the context of the phenomenology it means journey, the journey of the understanding. How does understanding journey from this primitive form of Stoicism to unhappy consciousness? So, of course, you don't take Hegel literally in that portion of the phenomenology, because it's actually a metaphorical account of how consciousness dialectically evolves from primitive to maturity. From Stoicism, skepticism, to unhappy consciousness. Right? So it's a rhetorical, metaphorical way of saying the mind develops in such a way that you start with a naive position, and then in the course of history, you realize that that position is wrong, then you assume a new position. In the long run, you will also discover that that position is wrong, then you assume a third position. Right? So it's a phenomenological process. Now, so that's how the mind develops, according to Hegel. For example, this is your idea of critical theory, and then you listen to the lecture. My old idea is wrong. Critical theory is different from how we were taught before. So that's a dialectical movement in consciousness, in a Hegelian sense. Now you're ready to, for example, the Hegelian, by the way, he borrowed it from Fichte, the thesis, antithesis, synthesis. He simply borrowed it from Fichte. But that's a convenient way also of understanding the dialectical movement of consciousness. You start with a position, there's a new position which can replace or improve that old position. Then you assume a third position, which is a better position than the first and the second. Now, the critical theories understood that as a possible way of understanding how society works. And so they thought it's a form of critique of society. So that's the sense of critique that the critical theorists use when they read Hegel. It's very different from how Kant understands critique of purism. It's also different from our daily use of the word critique. But of course they are similar, because when you criticize someone, it's not simply a matter of bashing the person. You're saying something wrong about what he's doing, but at the same time you do it constructively. So critique is always constructive in that sense. Yes.
Last question.
This is time, but it's a little longer question. Thank you for the presentation, was super clear. But since you said that critical theory is strongly revolutionary, right? Has a revolutionary impulse, and is supposed to be translated, and in fact, it's translated into social and political claims, concrete, against society or against those factors in society that produce our oppression, our alienation. So for us to talk more concretely, what are those ideologies, or what have been those ideologies that produce our oppression, that we have to go, we can say to unmask, or we have to go against in order to reach liberation? Or at least in history, since 1923 until now, what are those ideologies that are being, we can say, that critical theory is trying to oppose in order to help us to be free from them since then until now? Or for example, one concrete point is, what is the relationship of critical theory with the sexual revolution in US in the 50s? No, for us to recognize more what are those ideologies concretely. No?
Okay. Well, of course, there are already things that were mentioned in the presentation, right? They were critical of facet of authoritarianism in whatever form, but in the literature, we usually find fascism in the form of, let's say, National Socialism or Soviet Marxism, and Adorno referring to capitalism in America as a form I call this a form of fascism, a form of kind of subtle authoritarianism, right? The thing is that if you look at, while they identify specific forms of ideology, they were able to identify specific forms of ideology because they were responding to their own milieu. They were responding to what the historical events during their time, right? That's why when you compare the first generation with Axel Honneth is more or less, Honneth is not worried about Auschwitz anymore. Honneth is not too worried about Soviet Marxism anymore. But Honneth now brings us to pathologies that happen on a daily basis. For example, misrecognition, maybe for instance, when you apply for a job, right? And you are labeled as, well, no, maybe F, G, D, D, E, F, G. It depends on which letter you're associated with. And that's a form of recognition. Now, it's not necessarily ID, but of course, it's also a form of bias, right? So maybe, and then forms of social misrecognitions that we don't usually talk about. I mean, it's not simply, it's not as big. I mean, that kind of cultural misrecognition is not as big as, for example, the feminist revolution. Okay? But in a way, critical theory contributed also to the feminist revolution. I'm not sure how to respond to your question exactly, sister, but I think it's better to, maybe they don't really specify the form of ideology. It depends on the situation. It depends on, I mean, if you ask, is critical theory possible in the Philippines? Is critical theory possible as a form of critique when we try to understand the plight of the Lumad, for example, in Mindanao, what's going on in Marawi, and these marginal spaces, so to speak. So where there are marginal spaces, the critical theory becomes a possibility. So we don't really need to identify big ideological, while it's possible to criticize them. I think critical theory can also work at the margins, exactly, at marginal spaces. I don't know if that makes sense. But I recommend reading Honneth at this point, right? If you want to find out in what situation is critical theory possible. In what situation is critical theory possible? But yeah, I mean, we've already mentioned a few of the historical pathologies that they reacted to. It's possible that in our time, we may react to whatever historical situation that may resemble the ones that they reacted to. But I mean, it's not for them to determine that anymore. Not for them to determine that anymore. Hopefully that makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Maybe now call Brother Romy Abulad to present the certificate. The Divine Word Mission Seminary.
Mr. Richard Moxon. The whole thing is organized. Well, I was there. I was the one. The content. I have nothing to do with the content. But the people who are actually organized it is the council, the student council of the seminary. It's the seminary. So the president is Mr. Richard Moxon. Could we also give him a So thank you very much.
To the certificate is as follows. The Divine Word Mission Seminary, in cooperation with the Divine Word Mission Seminary Student Council, gratefully presents this certificate of appreciation to Dr. Paolo A. Bolaños, Department of Philosophy, Chairperson, University of San Tomas, for his inspiring and insightful lecture on what is critical theory as a part of the Family Feast 2017 celebration in commemoration of the 142nd founding anniversary of the SBD, given on the 6th day of September 2017 at the St. Arnold Johnson Hall of the Divine Word Mission Seminary, Quezon City, Philippines. Signed, Father Carlos S. Lariosa, SBD Rector, Brother Romualdo E. Abulad, SBD PhD, Dean of Studies, and Father Jude Raymond J. Festing, SBD PhD, Provincial Superior.
Father Raymond Festin sends his regrets. He would have wanted to come here, but he's at the moment he's sick. He's trying to recover.